This system just got noticed by the models and folks. It went from an afterthought to something we genuinely need to talk about in the span of about 12 hours. In today's video, I'll walk you through the ongoing weather we're dealing with right now across a good chunk of the country. And then in the second half, I want to spend some real time on this tropical feature that barely anyone was paying attention to just yesterday and is now popping up on run after run of the guidance. If you stick around to the end, I've got a look at exactly who could be impacted and when. Welcome in, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Derek. I've been doing this forecasting thing for a good while now, and I appreciate you trusting me with your weather today. Let's not waste any time and get right into it. I want to start with what's actually happening outside right now, because that's going to set the stage for everything else we talk about. Looking at our water vapor imagery this morning, you can see a pretty impressive plume of moisture draped across the southeastern Gulf Coast, and this has been the story for a few days now. We've had rounds of heavy rain, a few pockets of flash flooding, and some scattered severe storms mixed in, mostly in the form of strong wind gusts. That plume isn't going anywhere fast. In fact, if anything, it's going to get reinforced over the next 48 hours, as an upper-level disturbance settles in and continues to tap into all that Gulf moisture. So if you're in the southeast and you're already tired of the rain, I've got some bad news because this pattern isn't breaking anytime soon. For the past 48 hours, radar estimated totals have come in around 4 to 6 inches in spots along the central Gulf Coast, with some isolated pockets pushing closer to 8 or 9 inches, where training thunderstorms set up over the same areas repeatedly. That's radar estimated, not official gauge data, but it tends to do a reasonably good job, especially with how dense our radar coverage is these days. Areas around the Florida Panhandle and into southern Alabama have really taken the brunt of it so far. And I'm watching a secondary hotspot developing along the South Carolina low country as well, where some of these same storms have been parked for what feels like way too long. As we move through today and tomorrow, this heavy rain threat is going to expand a bit and shift slightly. I think the immediate Gulf Coast gets a bit of a break later today as drier air starts to nose in from the west, but that relief is short-lived because a fresh wave OF energy riding along a stalled frontal boundary is going to redevelop heavy rain across the southeast tomorrow, and I think that's when places like Charleston, Savannah, and even into central Georgia could see some of the heaviest totals of this entire stretch. If you live in a flood-prone area or somewhere that struggles with drainage, I would keep a close eye on the radar over the next 24 to 48 hours, because a training band of thunderstorms can drop several inches of rain in a very short window, and that's exactly the kind of setup we're watching develop. Now let's talk about the severe weather piece of this, because it isn't just about the rain. The main threat, like we so often see this time of year, is going to be strong straight-line winds rather than anything more exotic. This really comes down to how much downdraft energy is available in the atmosphere, meaning how much potential there is for a thunderstorm's downward-moving air to translate into a strong gust at the surface once it reaches the ground. Right now, looking at that parameter across the southeast, we're seeing values climbing into a range that definitely gets my attention, particularly across central and eastern Georgia and into the Carolinas by later today and again tomorrow. When you get into that kind of range, it doesn't take a particularly strong or well-organized storm to produce a 60-mile-an-hour wind gust, and that's more than enough to knock down tree limbs, cause some isolated power outages, and create hazardous conditions on the roads. I do also want to mention a low but non-zero tornado threat with this system, mainly in the form of quick spin-up tornadoes rather than anything long-lived or particularly strong. There's just enough low-level turning in the atmosphere along the coast, especially where sea breeze interactions can locally enhance that spin, that I wouldn't be shocked to see an isolated tornado warning pop up somewhere along the immediate coastline over the next 48 hours. This is the kind of threat that's hard to pinpoint exactly where and when, but I wanted to flag it so nobody is caught totally off guard if a warning does go out for their area. All right, that covers the near-term rainfall and severe weather picture, and now let's get into the part of today's video that I think a lot of you are actually here for, because this is the system that quite literally went unnoticed by almost everybody until the last day or so, and now it's impossible to ignore. Let's play a quick game before I show you the details. If you were just glancing at satellite imagery right now without any other information, where would you guess the next area of interest is? A lot of people would look at the big blob of moisture over the southeast and assume that's the story. And in a way, you're right, because that ongoing feature is actually helping set the stage for what comes next. But the real system I want to talk about is out over the open Atlantic, well removed from the mainland. And up until very recently, it was such a disorganized mess of clouds that almost nobody was tracking it seriously. That's changed. Over the last 24 hours, this feature has consolidated noticeably. What was a broad, ill-defined area of low pressure has started to develop a more distinct center. And several of our reliable computer models have shifted from largely ignoring this thing to now showing at least some slow organization over the coming days. I want to be upfront that this is still not a lock to become anything named. But the trend has been consistently in one direction over the last several model cycles, and that's exactly the kind of trend that makes meteorologists sit up a little straighter. Let's look at the environment around this feature, because that's really what's going to determine whether this turns into something we need to worry about or just fizzles out over open water. Wind shear has actually been the main obstacle for development in the Atlantic Basin this year, and in a lot of ways, that's still true today. If you look at a wind shear map of the broader Atlantic, the Caribbean in particular is about as hostile an environment as you'll find, and that's fairly typical, since the overall pattern this year has favored a lot of sinking air and dry conditions across that region. But right where our feature of interest is located, wind shear has actually been trending down over the last couple of days, and the latest guidance shows that trend continuing through the middle to end of this week. That's a meaningful shift, because lower shear gives a disorganized system the chance to actually build a healthy core of thunderstorms around its center, rather than getting sheared apart before it can get going. Moisture is the other piece of the puzzle, and this is honestly where things get interesting. There's been a stubborn plume of dry air and Saharan dust sitting over a good chunk of the tropical Atlantic, and that's been a major reason so many disturbances have failed to develop this season. But right along the track this system is expected to take, moisture values have been creeping up, partly because of the same broader pattern that's been dumping so much rain across our southeast, and partly because the dry air has been slowly eroding in that specific corridor. By the time we get toward the end of the week, the moisture environment around this feature should be noticeably more supportive than it has been for most disturbances we've tracked so far this year. So here's how I see the timeline shaking out. Over the next day or so, I expect this system to remain a fairly broad and disorganized area of low pressure, still without a well-defined center, but slowly consolidating. By the middle of the week, I think we start to see a more focused area of spin developing, and that's when I'd expect the National Hurricane Center to begin highlighting this in their tropical outlook, if they haven't already by the time you're watching this. Heading into the latter part of the week, if the trends continue the way the last few model runs have suggested, I think there's a real chance this organizes into at least a tropical depression and possibly a weak tropical storm as it approaches the western Atlantic. Now, track is the other big question, and I want to be honest that there's still a meaningful spread in the guidance here. Some of our more reliable models want to bring this system on a path that stays fairly close to the Bahamas before curving north, which would put the southeast coastline, including Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, in a position where impacts become increasingly likely by this weekend. Other guidance keeps this system a bit further out to sea, suggesting more of a track that parallels the coast without a direct approach. Given the spread we're still seeing, I don't want anyone to lock into one specific outcome, but I do think the trend over the last several runs has been to nudge the track slightly closer to the coast rather than further away. And that's worth paying attention to, regardless of whether this ultimately earns a name, and I want to stress that it might not. Given how much uncertainty remains in the intensity forecast, I think the impacts along the southeast coast are going to be felt one way or another. Even a disorganized tropical low can tap into a tremendous amount of moisture and produce very heavy rainfall totals, especially if it slows down or stalls anywhere near the coast, which some of the guidance is hinting at as a real possibility heading into the weekend. So my advice here is simple. Don't wait for this thing to get a name before you start paying attention, because the rainfall and rip current impacts could show up regardless of what the official classification ends up being. Let's talk specifically about who needs to be watching this closest. Right now, I think the area with the highest likelihood of seeing direct impacts stretches from around the space coast of Florida northward, through Georgia and into the Carolinas, with the Outer Banks of North Carolina standing out to me as a spot that could end up right in the bullseye, given how that stretch of coastline tends to stick out relative to the rest of the track guidance. If you've got plans at the beach this coming weekend anywhere along that stretch, I wouldn't cancel anything just yet, but I would keep a very close eye on the forecast over the next few days, because this is exactly the kind of system that can go from an afterthought to a legitimate travel-altering event in a short amount of time, which honestly is exactly what's already happened over just the last day. I also want to spend a moment on why this system managed to sneak up on so many people, because I think it's actually a good learning opportunity. Early in the week, IES was such a sprawling, disorganized mess of low-level spin and scattered showers that most of the automated tracking tools didn't even flag it as a system worth a percentage. Chance of development. It looked, frankly, kind of unimpressive on satellite, especially compared to the much flashier plume of moisture that was dumping rain across our own backyard here in the southeast. But this is a great example of why we don't just look at satellite appearance alone. Underneath that unimpressive cloud field, the actual low-level circulation was there. It was just fighting against dry air and marginal shear. Once those two ingredients started to improve, even slightly, the system had what it needed to start organizing. And that's exactly what we're now seeing play out in the model data. I want to touch on one more piece of the broader Atlantic picture before we wrap up the tropical discussion, because there's actually a decent amount going on out there beyond just this one feature. Our intertropical convergence zone, which is basically the band near the equator where converging trade winds tend to spark up clusters of thunderstorms that can occasionally organize into tropical waves, has been trying to get a bit more active over the past week. I'm watching for a stronger tropical wave that current guidance suggests could move off the coast of Africa in around a week to 10 days. Wind shear in that part of the basin has also been trending slightly more favorable, so this is a feature worth keeping half an eye on, even though I want to be clear that it's very far out in terms of timing, and there's a lot the IT could change between now and then. The odds of that particular wave ever becoming a concern for the United States are pretty low. Based on current pattern trends, but in a year where the basin has been unusually quiet, any sign of increasing activity is worth mentioning. Now let's bring this back to something a little more concrete, and that's the rainfall forecast over the next several days, combining both the ongoing southeast system and this newly noticed tropical feature. If I show you our extended rainfall outlook, you can see two distinct areas of concern. The first is the immediate southeast coast, where the ongoing frontal system is going to keep dropping rounds of heavy rain through tomorrow and into the following day, with some additional pockets of 4 to 6 inches possible, especially anywhere that sees repeated rounds of training thunderstorms. The second area, and this is the one that's going to grow in significance as we move through the week, is that same general corridor from Florida up through the Carolinas, where moisture associated with our tropical feature is going to start streaming in by later in the week. If the current track guidance verifies even reasonably well, I think we could be looking at storm total rainfall amounts in the range of 6 to 10 inches for some spots right along the coast by the time this feature moves through this weekend, with isolated higher amounts possible if the system slows down the way some of the guidance is suggesting. I want to reiterate that flooding, not wind, is going to be the primary hazard with this tropical feature, at least based on what we know right now. Even weak, poorly organized tropical systems have an incredible capacity to produce dangerous flash flooding, especially when they interact with a coastline that's already saturated from days of prior rainfall, which is exactly the situation we're setting up for here. So if you live anywhere in that zone from central Florida up through the Carolina coast, I'd start thinking now about what your personal flood risk looks like, whether that's a low-lying street you drive on regularly, a basement that's flooded before, or a storm drain near your home that tends to back up during heavy rain events. Storm surge is a secondary concern that I'll be watching more closely as we get better information on both the track and the intensity of the system. Right now, given how disorganized this feature still is, I don't think we're talking about a significant storm surge G threat, but if this does manage to organize into even a weak tropical storm as it approaches the coast, I wouldn't rule out some minor to moderate surge issues in typically vulnerable spots, especially if the timing lines up with higher than normal tides, which is something I'll have more clarity on in the coming days. Before I get into the recap, I want to spend a little more time on a couple of pieces here because I think there are some finer details worth digging into, especially for those of you along the coast trying to plan around this. Let's start with the question I know a lot of you are already asking, which is simply, how confident am I in this actually becoming something named? Honestly, right now I'd put it at a little better than a coin flip, and I say that fully acknowledging how much can change in a system this disorganized. The thing that gives me a bit more confidence than I might otherwise have is the consistency of the trend. It's not that one single model run suddenly showed development and the rest disagreed. Instead, we've seen a gradual overrun shift across multiple independent modeling systems, all pointing in the same direction of slow organization. When you see that kind of agreement building over time, rather than a single outlier run, that's usually a sign the atmosphere itself is genuinely trending that way, rather than it just being noise in the model. I also want to explain a little more about why the track guidance still has so much spread at this point, because I know it can be frustrating to hear it could go here or it could go there without much more specificity. The honest answer is that until a system develops a well-defined, persistent center of circulation, the models simply don't have a strong signal to lock onto. Right now, this feature still has a somewhat broad and elongated area of low pressure rather than a single tight center, and that ambiguity in the initial position translates directly into ambiguity in the projected track. As soon as we get a more consolidated center, and I do think that's likely within the next day or two based on current trends, I'd expect the track guidance to tighten up noticeably, and that's when I'll be able to give you a much more specific answer on exactly which stretch of coastline needs to be the most concerned. I also want to address the rip current and beach safety angle here because even well before any potential landfall or close approach, a system like this out in the Atlantic can churn up dangerous surf conditions along the coast far in advance of any direct impact. Even if this system stays weak or ends up tracking further offshore than the current guidance suggests, I would still expect a period of significantly elevated rip current risk along much of the southeast coast later this week and into the weekend, simply due to the increased swell this system is going to generate as it moves through the western Atlantic. If you've got beach plans, please pay close attention to any flag warnings and lifeguard guidance because rip currents are one of the more underappreciated hazards that come with these kinds of systems, named or not. They tend to cause more fatalities in a typical season than people expect. One more thing I want to touch on is how this ongoing southeast rainfall pattern is actually going to interact with the tropical feature once it gets closer. It's not just a coincidence that both of these stories are unfolding at the same time. The same broad pattern that has kept our atmosphere so moisture-rich over the past several days is part of what's helping erode the dry air that was previously choking off development out in the Atlantic. So, in a strange way, the very system that's been dumping rain on us here at home has been quietly setting the table for this tropical feature to take advantage of a more favorable moisture environment as it approaches. That's part of why I think, even if the tropical system itself stays relatively weak, the rainfall totals along the coast this weekend could still end up being quite significant, because it will essentially be tapping into and reinforcing a pattern that was already primed for heavy rain before it ever arrived. All right, let's recap everything we've covered today, because I know that's a lot of information across two very different topics. In the near term, we've got an ongoing plume of tropical moisture that's already dropped significant rainfall across the Gulf Coast and southeast, and that's going to continue with additional rounds of heavy rain today and tomorrow, especially as a secondary wave of energy redevelops storms along a stalled frontal boundary. The main severe weather concern with this ongoing system is strong straight-line winds, with a low but real chance of an isolated spin-up tornado, mainly along the coast. Then, shifting to the bigger story of today's video, we've got a tropical feature T over the Atlantic that went from almost completely unnoticed to a legitimate system worth tracking in the span of about a day, thanks to improving wind shear and increasing moisture along its path. This system may or may not ever earn an official name, but regardless of that classification, I think impacts in the form of heavy rain, rough surf, and possibly some minor coastal flooding are increasingly likely for the southeast coast, especially Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas as we head into the upcoming weekend. My advice, as always with a system like this, is to not wait until it has a name or an official designation before you start paying attention. The rainfall and coastal impacts from a disorganized tropical low can be every bit as significant as those from a named storm, and in some cases, a slow-moving, poorly organized system can actually produce worse flooding than a fast-moving, well-organized one, simply because it lingers over the same area for longer. If you've got outdoor plans along the coast this weekend, keep a close eye on the forecast over the next few days, because I do think the picture is going to keep evolving, and there's a real chance we're talking about this in much more definitive terms by tomorrow's update. I'll be watching the trends closely over the next 24 to 48 hours, particularly on that track guidance and on whether the system manages to develop a well-defined center of circulation, because that's really the key piece of information that will help firm up exactly where the heaviest impacts end up. As always, if anything changes in a meaningful way, I'll have an update for you well before we get to the weekend. Here are your final points for today. First, flooding is going to remain the primary concern in the near term thanks to our ongoing southeast system, with additional rounds of heavy rain expected today and tomorrow, especially across Georgia and the Carolinas. Second, watch the southeast coast, particularly Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, with the Outer Banks standing out as a possible focal point for impacts from this newly organizing tropical feature as we head toward the weekend. And third, keep half an eye on the broader Atlantic, because there are early signs of increasing activity further out, even though the immediate threat to the United States from that piece remains low for now. Hey folks, if this video helped you plan out your week, do me a favor and like it, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. That really does help these videos reach more people who need this information, and it helps me keep doing this every single day. I also want to say thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Directly, it genuinely means a lot and helps me keep bringing you these daily updates. That's all I've got for today's forecast. Appreciate you tuning in and trusting me with your weather. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you all tomorrow with another brand new update.